Open this gate immediately, you hillbilly nobody, or I'll have you arrested for obstruction.
The woman's voice cut through the Texas afternoon heat like a rusty blade. Celeste Ashworth stood there in her wrinkled light blue suit, sweat stains darkening the fabric under her arms, despite the designer cut that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her perfectly manicured finger pointed at the iron gate like she was commanding a servant, while two men in fake uniforms flanked her sides next to a black SUV, with tinted windows that screamed government authority, but smelled like rental car air freshener. The dust kicked up by their arrival had settled into a golden haze in the late afternoon sun, creating long shadows that stretched across the gravel road. Through the metal bars, a man in a worn cowboy hat stood motionless, his weathered hands resting on his belt. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just watched with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing exactly who you are and exactly where you stand. Cade Thornfield had been checking the water levels in the cattle troughs when he heard the vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs moving fast down his private road, kicking up enough dust to choke a horse. His hand had instinctively moved to his hip, where a sidearm had once rested during 18 years of military service. Old habits. The motion was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice. But Celeste Ashworth wasn't most people. She was the kind of predator who noticed every weakness, every tell, every sign of uncertainty she could exploit. What she didn't notice was the way Cade's eyes had gone cold and calculating the moment she'd called him a nobody. Those weren't the eyes of a simple rancher. They were the eyes of someone who'd made life and death decisions in places where mistakes meant body bags and folded flags. "Ma'am," Cade finally spoke, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to giving orders rather than taking them. "This is private property. You're trespassing." Celeste's laugh was sharp and artificial, like breaking glass wrapped in silk. "Private property?" She waved a manila folder thick with official-looking documents. "Mr. Thornfield, I'm Celeste Ashworth, president of the Prairie Hills Development Homeowners Association. According to County Ordinance 73-42, all private roads servicing more than 5 residential properties fall under HOA jurisdiction for inspection and maintenance purposes." The lies rolled off her tongue with the practiced ease of someone who'd been using fake authority to intimidate people for years. Behind her, the 2 fake officers nodded like trained seals, their polyester uniforms catching the light in all the wrong ways. Real law enforcement wore uniforms that fit properly, and badges that didn't look like they'd been ordered from a costume website. Cade's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if you didn't look too closely at his eyes. County Ordinance 73-42 was repealed in 2019, ma'am. And my road services exactly 1 property, mine. Now, before I tell you how this small-town tyrant learned who she was really messing with, drop a comment and let me know what country you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers around the world. And trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. The color drained from Celeste's face so quickly, you could practically watch her blood pressure spike. She'd clearly expected to steamroll another ignorant property owner who wouldn't know the difference between legitimate authority and a well-crafted bluff. Instead, she'd just run headfirst into someone who not only knew the law, but had the confidence of someone used to operating under much higher stakes. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Thornfield," she said, her voice climbing an octave. "The Prairie Hills development maintains property values for over 300 families. Your refusal to cooperate affects everyone in this community." "Which community would that be?" Cade asked. "Because according to my survey, the nearest Prairie Hills development property is 14 miles southeast of here. This land has been in the Thornfield family since 1927, and it's never been part of any HOA. That was when Celeste made her first critical error. Instead of cutting her losses and retreating to regroup, she doubled down. "Survey records can be incorrect," she snapped. "My information shows this access road was designated as a community thoroughfare in 1987. Cade's hand moved again, this time reaching into his shirt pocket to pull out a folded document that looked like it had been handled by lawyers and sealed by judges. "Federal land grant confirmation," he said quietly. "Recorded with the Bureau of Land Management on March 15, 1987. This property was transferred from decommissioned Federal Military Reserve status to private ownership. No easements, no public access, no community designations." The paper might as well have been a death sentence for Celeste's entire plan. Meridian Development Corporation had paid her $230,000 to acquire this specific piece of property by any means necessary. The luxury resort they wanted to build needed this exact access road to connect to the main highway system. Without it, their $30 million project would be landlocked and worthless. But Celeste Ashworth hadn't clawed her way to the top of 3 different HOA boards by backing down when things got complicated. She'd built her reputation on grinding down opposition through sheer persistence, legal intimidation, and strategic character assassination. If she couldn't get the property through fake legal pressure, she'd destroy the man who owned it. "Federal Military Reserve," she repeated with mock concern. "That's interesting, Mr. Thornfield. Because military reservations often come with restrictions on current use, environmental assessments, federal oversight, surprise inspections." Her smile turned predatory. "I wonder if all your current activities are in compliance with federal regulations." It was a fishing expedition disguised as a threat, but it landed uncomfortably close to several truths Cade wasn't ready to share. His property did indeed sit on former federal land, but what Celeste didn't know was that his military service had ended with a medical discharge following an incident in Afghanistan that left him with a government pension, a Purple Heart, and clearance documentation that would make her fabricated authority look like a child's crayon drawing. The PTSD wasn't something he advertised. Neither was the fact that his ranch wasn't just a place to raise cattle and find peace. It was the one place on earth where he felt safe enough to sleep without checking every lock twice and positioning his bed to have clear sight lines to all entry points. The day someone breached that sanctuary was the day Cade Thornfield would remember exactly why the Pentagon had taught him 17 different ways to neutralize threats without making noise. "Ma'am," he said, his voice growing quieter in the way that made smart people nervous. "I'm going to ask you one more time to remove yourself and your associates from my property. After that, I'll be contacting the appropriate authorities." Celeste's laugh was uglier this time. "The appropriate authorities? Like who? Deputy Garrison?" She gestured toward the fake officers. "Blake and I go way back. His campaign fund received very generous contributions from concerned citizens who appreciate law enforcement that supports community values." That particular revelation hit differently than she'd intended. If Celeste Ashworth was confident enough to openly admit she'd bought local law enforcement, then this wasn't her first rodeo. She'd done this before, probably multiple times, to people who couldn't fight back. The thought of other families being intimidated and forced from their homes by this woman's manufactured authority made something dark and cold unfurl in Cade's chest. "Blake Garrison," he repeated, filing the name away for future reference. "I'll be sure to mention your contribution to community relations when I speak with him." The implied threat sailed right over Celeste's head. She was already pulling out her phone, fingers moving fast across the screen. "Blake, it's Celeste. I need you at the Thornfield property immediately. We have an uncooperative landowner who's refusing to allow legally mandated inspection access. Yes, I have the documentation. He's being hostile and threatening. The performance was Oscar-worthy in its complete fabrication of reality. Cade hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threatening gesture, and had been nothing but professionally polite. But in Celeste's version of events, he was already being transformed into a dangerous radical who needed immediate law enforcement intervention. While she talked, Cade noticed something interesting. The fake officer on her left kept glancing at his partner with obvious discomfort. His polyester uniform was too small across the shoulders, and he wore his badge like someone who wasn't used to carrying authority. More tellingly, he hadn't said a single word since arriving. Most law enforcement officers couldn't shut up when they were establishing jurisdiction and explaining procedures. The other fake officer was trying too hard to look official. He stood with military bearing, but kept checking his watch like he had somewhere else to be. His badge caught the light wrong, and his holster was positioned like someone who'd learned about police equipment from watching television rather than academy training. Professional criminals, then. Expensive ones, given their equipment and the quality of their fake credentials. That meant Celeste Ashworth had serious money behind her operation, and serious money usually meant serious consequences for failure. 20 minutes later, a genuine sheriff's department vehicle pulled up the road at a much more reasonable speed. Deputy Blake Garrison stepped out, wearing a real uniform that fit properly, and carried himself with the casual confidence of someone who'd never had to fake having authority. He was younger than Cade had expected, probably mid-30s, with the soft features of someone who'd won his position through politics rather than street experience. "Afternoon, folks," Garrison said, his voice professionally neutral but already tilted toward believing whatever Celeste was about to tell him. "I got a call about some kind of property dispute." Celeste was on him immediately, her voice shifting into the concerned citizen tone she'd probably perfected at city council meetings. "Deputy Garrison, thank you for coming so quickly. Mr. Thornfield is refusing to allow mandatory HOA inspection of his access road. He's been hostile and uncooperative despite our explanation of his legal obligations." Garrison looked at Cade with the expression of someone who'd already decided which side of the story he believed. "Sir, do you want to tell me your version of events?" "There is no version," Cade said calmly. "There are facts. This is private property. I've never been part of any HOA. The people standing behind you are trespassing, and at least 2 of them are impersonating law enforcement officers." That got Garrison's attention in a way Celeste hadn't expected. His head turned toward the fake officers, and his expression shifted from bored routine to active suspicion. "Could I see some identification, gentlemen?" The fake officers exchanged a glance that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Then the smaller one reached for what looked like a wallet, but moved with the nervous energy of someone who wasn't used to being questioned by real police. "Actually," Celeste interrupted quickly, "these are private security contractors hired by the HOA for resident protection during property inspections. They're not impersonating anyone." It was a smooth save that might have worked if she hadn't already told Garrison they were dealing with a hostile Private security contractors don't usually dress like federal officers unless they're trying to intimidate people through false authority. Garrison might have been politically motivated, but he wasn't stupid. "Private security," Garrison repeated slowly. "And you felt you needed armed security contractors to inspect a road." The hole Celeste had dug was getting deeper with every word. "Mr. Thornfield has been uncooperative and potentially threatening. We felt it was necessary to take proper safety precautions." Cade hadn't moved from his position by the gate, but something in his posture had shifted. The casual stance was gone. replaced by the alert readiness of someone who'd spent years operating in hostile environments. When he spoke, his voice carried a different quality than before. Deputy Garrison, I'd like to file a formal complaint against Ms. Ashworth for harassment, trespassing, and conspiracy to commit fraud through the use of false legal documents. The words hit the afternoon air like a challenge. Fraud was a felony charge, and conspiracy turned individual crimes into federal offenses. Celeste's face went pale again, but this time anger was replacing the fear. "False legal documents?" she sputtered. "These are official HOA compliance forms filed with the County Planning Commission." "Then you won't mind if I verify their authenticity," Cade said. He pulled out a phone that looked more sophisticated than standard civilian equipment and started dialing. "County Planning Commission, this is... Yes, I need to verify the status of HOA compliance documentation filed under Prairie Hills Development. Case number Alpha 779 Delta." The way he rattled off official reference numbers and spoke in bureaucratic shorthand made it clear this wasn't his first time navigating government systems. More importantly, the person on the other end of the phone seemed to know exactly who he was and why his inquiries took priority over normal processing procedures. "I see," Cade said after a moment. "No active filings under that case number. No current enforcement actions. Thank you. I'll file my report through normal channels." When he hung up, the silence stretched out like a held breath. Garrison was looking confused. Celeste was looking trapped. And the fake officers were looking like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. "It appears," Cade said quietly, "that no such documentation has been filed with any county office, which means Ms. Ashworth has been using fabricated legal papers to intimidate property owners." At this point, Celeste had no idea she'd just threatened a decorated military officer. If you were in Cade's boots, would you have kept your service record secret or revealed it immediately? Let me know in the comments below. That was when Celeste made her second critical error. Instead of cutting her losses and retreating, she went nuclear. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Mr. Thornfield, you're obstructing legitimate community oversight and endangering property values for 300 families. If you continue this behavior, I'll have no choice but to pursue civil action for damages and seek an injunction requiring you to comply with community standards." The threat of civil litigation was her nuclear option, and she'd just deployed it against someone who was beginning to look less like a simple rancher and more like someone with resources and connections that went far beyond rural Texas property law. Cade's response was to reach into his wallet and pull out a business card that he handed to Deputy Garrison. "If Ms. Ashworth wants to pursue legal action, she can have her attorneys contact my legal representation." Garrison looked at the card, and his expression changed completely. The casual dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something approaching concern. The business card listed a law firm in Washington, D.C. that specialized in federal land rights and military veteran affairs. More specifically, it was the kind of law firm that didn't take cases unless they involved significant federal interest and clients with serious government connections. "Mr. Thornfield," Garrison said carefully, "could I speak with you privately for a moment?" They walked a few steps away from Celeste and her fake officers. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully in fields that had supported the Thornfield family for nearly a century. The normalcy of the scene made the tension between the humans seem even more surreal. "Sir," Garrison said quietly, "I'm going to need to ask you about your military service." It wasn't a question. It was a statement from someone who'd suddenly realized he might be dealing with a veteran whose service record was classified at levels that made local law enforcement very uncomfortable. Cade reached into his wallet again and pulled out a military ID card that was definitely not standard veteran identification. It was current, not retired, and carried security clearance indicators that made Garrison's face go white. "Major Thornfield," Garrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I apologize. I had no idea." "No apology necessary, Deputy," Cade said. "But I think it's time Ms. Ashworth understood exactly what kind of federal oversight she's been claiming to represent." They walked back to where Celeste was standing with her arms crossed, tapping her foot in a display of impatience that was about to become very expensive for her. "Ms. Ashworth," Garrison said, his voice carrying a new edge, "I need you to explain exactly what authority you believe gives you the right to inspect federal property." "Federal property?" Celeste's voice cracked slightly. "This isn't federal property. This is private ranch land." "Private ranch land," Garrison repeated, "on a federal land grant held by a current military officer with active security clearance, which means any harassment, intimidation, or fraudulent legal action against him becomes a federal crime under the Military Protection Act." The Military Protection Act was a law most people had never heard of, but it carried serious penalties for anyone stupid enough to target active military personnel with fraudulent legal schemes. Celeste's face went through several colors as she processed the implications of what she'd just walked into. But Celeste Ashworth hadn't gotten where she was by backing down when things got complicated. She'd gotten there by finding new ways to attack when the old ways stopped working. "Federal land grant or not," she said, rallying her remaining courage, "community safety standards still apply. If Mr. Thornfield is storing hazardous materials or operating unpermitted facilities, that affects everyone in the area regardless of his military status." It was another fishing expedition, but this one was closer to home than she realized. Cade's property did indeed contain several structures that weren't exactly standard ranch equipment. The concrete bunker built during the Cold War era still held emergency supplies and communication equipment that could contact several federal agencies directly. The workshop where he maintained his vehicles was equipped with tools that could repair everything from farm equipment to military hardware. None of it was illegal, but all of it would be difficult to explain to someone who was already looking for reasons to cause problems. "Hazardous materials," Cade repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting concern, Ms. Ashworth. Are you suggesting that federal authorities should conduct an environmental inspection of my property?" "If necessary," she said, apparently not realizing she was about to step on a landmine. "Then I'm sure you won't mind if they also inspect the environmental compliance records for the Meridian Development Project you're being paid to facilitate." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the wind moving through the grass fields. Celeste's face went from red to white to green in the span of about 10 seconds. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice had lost all its earlier authority. "Meridian Development Corporation," Cade said calmly. "Shell company registered in Delaware, funded through a Cayman Islands investment group that's currently under federal investigation for money laundering. They're paying you $230,000 to acquire this property for their resort project. The same resort project that's been denied environmental permits twice because of protected wetlands on the proposed construction site." The information bomb Cade had just dropped made it clear that someone had been doing very thorough research into Celeste's activities. The kind of research that required access to financial records, corporate filings, and federal investigation databases that weren't available to regular citizens. Celeste's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Behind her, the fake officers were starting to edge toward their SUV with the nervous energy of hired help, who suddenly realized their employer had dragged them into something much bigger and more dangerous than advertised. How did you? She started, then caught herself before admitting to anything. Ma'am, Cade said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a slow child, you just threatened to bring federal environmental inspectors to a property owned by someone with active federal security clearance. Did you think I wouldn't make some phone calls before that happened? The truth was even more complicated than that. Cade's security clearance was tied to his ongoing reserve status, which required periodic updates from federal agencies that kept track of any potential security risks to cleared personnel. When someone with Celeste's background started making aggressive moves against federal property, it triggered automatic notifications that reached some very serious people in some very serious government offices. Those people had spent the last 4 hours providing Cade with a comprehensive briefing on exactly who Celeste Ashworth was, who she worked for, and what kind of federal crimes she was walking into. Deputy Garrison looked like he wanted to arrest someone, but wasn't sure who or for what. The fake officers looked like they wanted to disappear entirely, and Celeste looked like someone who was beginning to realize that her carefully constructed scam had just collapsed into a federal investigation. This conversation is over, she said abruptly. Gentlemen, we're leaving. But as she turned toward the SUV, one of the fake officers made the mistake that would ultimately destroy any chance she had of escaping consequences. His phone buzzed, and he instinctively checked the message. What he saw made his face go pale, and he whispered something urgent to his partner. Both fake officers immediately started walking faster toward their vehicle, abandoning Celeste entirely. They knew something she didn't, and whatever it was had scared them enough to forget about their employer and focus entirely on getting away from federal property as quickly as possible. Celeste found herself standing alone in the dusty road. Her authority evaporated, her backup gone, and her carefully planned intimidation campaign turned into a potential federal crime investigation. Behind her, Deputy Garrison was making his own phone calls, probably to people who would want to know exactly how a local HOA president had obtained fake federal officers for a property harassment campaign. Miss Ashworth, Cade said quietly, I believe you mentioned something about appropriate authorities. 20 minutes later, Evelyn Hartwell was sitting in her small office at the Prairie Hills Development Community Center, staring at her computer screen with growing horror. The email thread between Celeste and Meridian Development Corporation was still open in her browser, along with bank statements showing the $230,000 payment that had come through 3 weeks ago. Evelyn had been Celeste's secretary and bookkeeper for 4 years, ever since her husband lost his job at the plant, and they needed steady income. She'd told herself that Celeste's aggressive tactics were just part of maintaining property values and community standards. Everyone else seemed to accept it, and the pay was better than anything else available in a town where most of the good jobs had disappeared years ago. But what she was looking at now wasn't aggressive community management. It was a conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery, and probably several other felonies she didn't want to think about. The worst part was the detailed plan Celeste had laid out for convincing other property owners to sell if the Thornfield intimidation campaign was successful. 18 families owned land adjacent to the proposed resort site, and Celeste had methodical strategies for pressuring each of them through fake legal actions, manufactured code violations, and coordinated harassment campaigns. Evelyn's hands were shaking as she saved copies of everything to a secure drive. She'd known Celeste was ruthless, but this was a criminal enterprise disguised as community activism. And now that federal authorities were apparently involved, everyone associated with the operation could face serious prison time. Her phone rang, making her jump. Evelyn, it's Celeste. I need you to delete all the Meridian correspondence from the server immediately. All of it. Bank records, email chains, meeting notes, everything. The request confirmed Evelyn's worst fears. Celeste was already destroying evidence, which meant she knew the federal investigation was real and serious. Celeste, Evelyn said carefully, what happened at the Thornfield property? Nothing that concerns you. Just delete those files and go home early today. Take tomorrow off too. Paid, of course. The offer of paid time off when Celeste normally nickel and dimed every expense told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how serious the situation had become. I'll take care of it, Evelyn lied. Instead of deleting anything, she spent the next hour creating detailed copies of every document, every email, every financial record that could be connected to Celeste's operation. If federal investigators were going to come looking, she wanted to be able to cooperate fully rather than face obstruction charges for following her boss's instructions. The decision felt like stepping off a cliff, but Evelyn had been watching Celeste destroy people's lives for years without saying anything. She'd told herself it wasn't her business, that she was just the secretary, that she needed the job too much to risk making waves. But watching federal crimes being committed in real time was different. This wasn't community politics anymore. This was serious criminal activity that could send everyone involved to federal prison for decades. As the sun set over the Texas landscape, Evelyn Hartwell made the most important decision of her life. She picked up her phone and called the FBI field office in Houston. Federal Bureau of Investigation. How can I help you? I need to report a federal crime in progress, Evelyn said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Bribery, conspiracy, and fraud involving federal land rights. Ma'am, I'm going to transfer you to Agent Morrison. Please hold while I connect you. While she waited, Evelyn looked out her office window at the quiet suburban street where most of the Prairie Hills development residents lived their normal lives, completely unaware that their HOA president had just triggered a federal investigation that would make national headlines. Her computer chimed with a new email from Celeste. Evidence disposal complete. Take the rest of the week off. Situation contained. Evelyn smiled grimly as she forwarded the message to the secure drive where she'd been collecting evidence. Celeste Ashworth had no idea that her cleanup operation had just provided federal investigators with perfect evidence of obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Ma'am, this is Agent Morrison. I understand you have information about federal crimes involving land rights. Agent Morrison, Evelyn said, you're going to want to send someone to collect about 4 years' worth of documentation. And you're going to want to do it tonight, before anyone else realizes I'm talking to you. As she began explaining the situation to Agent Morrison, Evelyn could see Celeste's house in the distance, lights blazing as the HOA president probably worked frantically to cover her tracks and plan her next move. What Celeste didn't know was that her next move was going to be monitored by federal agents who now had a cooperative witness with access to all the evidence needed to prove conspiracy, bribery, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The small-town tyrant who'd spent years terrorizing property owners had finally picked the wrong target. And tomorrow morning, she was going to discover exactly what happened when fake authority met real federal power. The next morning brought the kind of silence that comes before storms. Cade was checking his cattle when he noticed the unusual number of vehicles parked along the county road that bordered his property. Black sedans with government plates, a mobile communication truck disguised as a utility vehicle, and what looked like a surveillance van positioned where operators could monitor everything happening on his land. Federal agents had arrived during the night, but they'd done it with the kind of professional discretion that suggested this operation went far beyond a simple property dispute. When your security clearance reaches certain levels, you learn to recognize the signs of a federal investigation in progress. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Major Thornfield, Agent Morrison, FBI. We'd appreciate a brief conversation at your convenience. We're parked at the intersection of County Road 47 and your access road. Cade drove down to meet them in his pickup truck, noting the professional way the agents had positioned their vehicles for both concealment and quick response. Agent Morrison turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, who carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years dismantling criminal conspiracies. Major, thank you for meeting with us. We understand you had an interesting encounter yesterday with Celeste Ashworth. I did, Cade confirmed, along with two individuals impersonating federal officers and a deputy sheriff who seemed unusually supportive of fraudulent legal documents. About those fraudulent documents, Agent Morrison said, we've had a very productive conversation with Ms. Ashworth's secretary, Evelyn Hartwell. It seems your property dispute is connected to a much larger criminal enterprise. She handed him a tablet displaying bank records, email chains, and what looked like a comprehensive organizational chart showing financial connections between Celeste, Meridian Development Corporation, and several other entities that had the unmistakable structure of a money laundering operation. Meridian Development is a shell company, Morrison continued. The real money comes from a group of investors who've been buying rural properties through intimidation and fraud, then flipping them to legitimate development companies at massive profits. Your property was supposed to be acquisition number 47. The scope of the operation was staggering. 46 families had already lost their land to Celeste's manufactured legal pressure, fake code violations, and coordinated harassment campaigns. Most had been elderly or financially vulnerable people who couldn't afford to fight extended legal battles against well-funded opponents. What happened to those families? Cade asked. Forced sales at below-market prices, followed by immediate resale to development companies for 2 to 3 times what the original owners received. We estimate the total fraud at over $18 million. $18 million in stolen property value, dozens of destroyed lives, and a criminal conspiracy that had been operating for over 6 years without anyone having the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. Until Celeste had made the mistake of targeting a federal property owned by someone with active security clearance and direct access to agencies that took crimes against military personnel very seriously. We're planning to make arrests this evening, Morrison said. Ms. Ashworth has called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she's calling federal harassment of community leadership. The meeting is scheduled for 7 p.m. at the Prairie Hills Community Center, and she's encouraging residents to bring cameras for social media documentation. The irony was perfect. Celeste intended to use the community meeting to rally public support against federal overreach, not realizing that federal agents would be using the same gathering to arrest her for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering in front of everyone she'd been claiming to protect. Will you need me there? Cade asked. Only if you want to watch, Morrison said, with a slight smile. Though I suspect the community might benefit from hearing the truth about what their HOA president has been doing in their name. That evening, the Prairie Hills Community Center parking lot was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through social media that their HOA president was facing some kind of federal investigation, and residents wanted answers. Cars were parked along the street for 3 blocks in every direction, and several local news crews had set up cameras near the building entrance. Inside, Celeste had positioned herself at the front of the room like she was holding court rather than facing potential arrest. She wore her best light blue power suit and had her hair styled in a way that suggested she'd been preparing for television coverage. Around her sat the remaining HOA board members, looking increasingly uncomfortable as they realized how many federal vehicles were parked outside. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Celeste began, her voice projecting the confident authority she'd perfected over years of intimidating property owners. "As many of you have heard, our community is under attack by federal agents who are attempting to interfere with legitimate HOA governance." The crowd murmured with confusion and concern. Most of the residents had no idea what their HOA president had been doing beyond the normal complaints about lawn maintenance and architectural standards. The idea that federal agents were investigating their suburban homeowners association seemed surreal. "The issue began," Celeste continued, "when a new property owner refused to comply with community standards and threatened federal retaliation against volunteers trying to maintain neighborhood property values. She was painting herself as a victim of federal overreach, hoping to rally community support before anyone could learn the truth about her criminal activities. It was a calculated gamble that might have worked if she hadn't been speaking to a room that included half a dozen federal agents and several residents who'd been quietly contacted by the FBI over the past 24 hours. Dr. Ruth Kingsley stood up from her seat in the third row. The retired physician had been one of Celeste's most reliable supporters for years, always voting in favor of stricter HOA enforcement and higher fees for community improvements. "Celeste," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the room, "I think people need to know that federal agents visited me this morning. They showed me bank records proving that you've been taking money from a development company to force people to sell their property." The community center went dead silent. Celeste's face went through several color changes as she processed the fact that her own supporters were now armed with evidence of her crimes. "That's ridiculous," Celeste said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. "Kingsley, you've been misinformed by federal agents who are trying to discredit community leadership. They showed me the emails, Celeste. Your emails. The ones where you called community members targets for acquisition and discussed which families would be easiest to intimidate into selling. If you're still watching up to this point, you're about to witness the most satisfying takedown of an HOA tyrant I've ever covered. Show some love by dropping a fire emoji if you're ready to see justice served." More residents began standing up, each one armed with pieces of the federal investigation that had been shared with them as part of building a case for victims' rights restitution. Marcus Webb, the bank director who'd once dismissed Cade as unsuitable for the community, cleared his throat. "Celeste, the FBI showed me records proving that you've embezzled over $89,000 from our HOA maintenance fund, money that was supposed to pay for road repairs and landscaping improvements." The accusations were coming faster now, each one backed by federal documentation that Celeste couldn't dispute or dismiss. The community she'd controlled through fear and intimidation was learning that their trusted leader had been systematically stealing from them while using their HOA fees to fund criminal activities. "This is a coordinated attack," Celeste said desperately. "Federal agents are manipulating community members to destroy legitimate local governance." That was when the Henderson family stood up together, the young couple who'd been terrified that Cade's presence would hurt their property values. Tom Henderson held up a tablet displaying what looked like legal documents. "These are the court filings the FBI helped us prepare," he said. "Celeste, you're being sued by 47 families for conspiracy, fraud, and theft. The total damages are over $22 million. The number hit the room like a physical blow. $22 million in damages meant this wasn't just local HOA corruption. This was an organized criminal enterprise that had been operating under the cover of community leadership for years. Celeste was trapped. Celeste was, every direction she looked, former supporters were armed with evidence of her crimes. The room full of people she'd controlled and manipulated for years was turning into a jury of her victims. "Ladies and gentlemen," a new voice said from the back of the room, "this is Agent Morrison, Federal Bureau of Investigation." The agent walked down the center aisle with the measured pace of someone who'd done this many times before. Behind her, 6 additional federal agents entered through multiple doors, effectively surrounding the front of the room where Celeste and her board members were sitting. "Celeste Ashworth, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and violations of the Federal Mail Fraud Act." The reading of Miranda rights seemed to take forever in the absolute silence of the community center. Celeste's face went from defiant to terrified as the handcuffs clicked into place and the reality of federal prison sentences began to sink in. "This is illegal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was protecting community property values." "Ma'am," Agent Morrison said with professional courtesy, "protecting community property values doesn't typically involve shell companies in the Cayman Islands and fabricated legal documents." As federal agents escorted Celeste toward the exit, her carefully constructed authority crumbled completely. The woman who'd terrorized property owners for years was reduced to a figure in handcuffs being led away by people with real federal authority. But the arrests weren't finished. Clay Barron and Brock Stetson, the fake officers from the previous day, were taken into custody for impersonating federal agents. Deputy Blake Garrison was suspended pending investigation into his financial relationship with Celeste's operation, and 3 HOA board members who'd knowingly participated in the fraud scheme found themselves facing their own federal charges. In the chaos that followed, Cade Thornfield slipped quietly out of the building and drove home to his ranch. The cattle were waiting for their evening feed, and the sunset painted the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson that had nothing to do with criminal conspiracies or federal investigations. His phone buzzed with messages from reporters wanting interviews, neighbors wanting to apologize, and federal agents needing follow-up information. But all of that could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, he wanted to sit on his front porch and listen to the silence that came with knowing his land was safe from people who confused manufactured authority with actual power. 6 months later, Evelyn Hartwell walked into the Prairie Hills Community Center for the first honest HOA meeting in years. As the newly elected president, she'd spent half a year helping federal investigators trace the money trails that Celeste had used to fund her criminal empire. The community had recovered most of their stolen HOA funds, and 47 families had received partial restitution for their fraudulently acquired properties. Celeste herself was serving 12 years in federal prison, with additional civil judgments that would keep her in debt for the rest of her life. Meridian Development Corporation had been dismantled, its assets seized and distributed to victims. The luxury resort that was supposed to be built on Cade's land had been permanently canceled when investigators discovered that the entire project had been designed around access to fraudulently acquired property. "Before we start tonight's meeting," Evelyn announced to the packed room, "I want to read a letter from Major Cade Thornfield." She unfolded a single sheet of paper with military precision. "Dear Prairie Hills residents, I'm writing to thank you for your support during the federal investigation that freed your community from criminal leadership. As a small token of appreciation, I'm donating $50,000 to your Community Improvement Fund, with the understanding that all expenditures will be transparent and all residents will have an equal voice in how the money is spent. Respectfully, Cade Thornfield, Major, United States Army." The applause was genuine and sustained. Outside, the Texas landscape stretched endlessly under stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless small tyrants who'd confused temporary power with permanent authority. If this story of standing up to corruption gives you chills, smash that like button and subscribe for more David versus Goliath victories. And if you want to help me keep exposing these schemes, the thanks button really helps support this channel. Justice, it turned out, wasn't about revenge or destruction. It was about restoring balance to a system where people like Celeste Ashworth could no longer use fake authority to terrorize families into surrendering what was rightfully theirs. Sometimes the most powerful response to manufactured authority was simply knowing the difference between real power and elaborate bluffing. And sometimes, when you stood your ground on principle, the ground itself turned out to be worth defending, not just for yourself, but for everyone who came after. The ripple effects of Celeste's downfall spread far beyond Prairie Hill's development. Her arrest became a case study taught at FBI training academies as an example of how organized fraud could hide behind legitimate community organizations. The investigation techniques developed during her case were used to dismantle similar schemes in 12 other states, ultimately recovering over $60 million in stolen property value for hundreds of families. Cade Thornfield never sought publicity for his role in exposing the conspiracy. He declined interview requests from national news networks and documentary filmmakers, preferring to let his cattle ranch return to the quiet anonymity he'd originally sought. But word spread through military networks about the major who'd single-handedly destroyed a criminal enterprise by simply knowing his rights and refusing to be intimidated. The Thornfield Ranch became an unofficial pilgrimage site for property owners facing similar harassment from corrupt HOA officials. Cade found himself offering quiet advice to families across the country, teaching them how to research property records, verify legal documents, and identify the difference between legitimate authority and elaborate intimidation campaigns. Dr. Ruth Kingsley established the Thornfield Foundation, a legal aid organization that provided free assistance to rural property owners facing fraudulent seizure attempts. The foundation's first victory came when they helped an elderly farming family in Oklahoma retain their ancestral land against a development company using tactics identical to Celeste's operation. Deputy Blake Garrison lost his badge and faced his own criminal charges for accepting bribes, but his case became a cautionary tale that helped clean up corruption in small-town law enforcement across 3 counties. His replacement, Deputy Sarah Martinez, implemented new procedures requiring independent verification of all legal documents before any property enforcement actions. On quiet evenings when the Texas wind carried the scent of prairie grass across his land, Cade would sometimes think about the families who'd lost their homes before anyone thought to check whether Celeste Ashworth's authority was real or manufactured. Their sacrifice hadn't been in vain if it meant future generations would know that in America, real authority comes from law and justice, not from bullying and fear. The gate to his property remained closed to uninvited visitors, but it was no longer a fortress against the world. It was simply the boundary between public and private space, respected by people who understood that property rights weren't just legal concepts, but the foundation of freedom itself.